welcome to our um, webinar, a special webinar featuring Mr. Jefferson Morley. Jefferson is a Washington journalist and a historian specializing in US intelligence and political history. He's the author of three acclaimed books about the CIA, Our Man in Mexico, The Ghost, and Scorpion's Dance. He's a longtime reporter and editor, and he's also the co-founder and editor of the JFK Facts Substack newsletter, which I subscribe to. It's fantastic. And he's also dedicated to uncovering new information and analysis about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the intelligence community. And more recently, he's been working with Representative Anna Paulina Luna as part of the House Oversight Task Force on declassification of federal secrets. So Jefferson Morley really is one of the world experts on the Kennedy assassination. So, Mr. Morley, welcome to York St. John, albeit virtually, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm looking forward to it too.
So I think just to kick off, obviously since President Trump issued his executive order, there's been some big releases, and which have been, and I know you talked about some in the past as well.
Yeah.
But I think and of course, you've also been in support of Representative Luna on the House committee, looking at this and giving testimony. So what do you think really been the most significant releases or new information that's come to light about the JFK assassination?
Well, the first thing, Jim, is I try not to get hung up on what's absolutely happened last week. Yes, we had very important disclosures beginning earlier this year with President Trump's order, but a lot of JFK information has been emerging over the past couple of years. So I don't limit myself to just what came out in March, although I'll talk about the most important things that came out in March. But we also want to talk about what's come out in the past 2 years, right? Not a huge amount of time in the past, but things that are still very new. So what have we learned? What have we learned? And the new releases in general in recent years, I mean, they undermine the story that was never particularly strong, that one man alone killed the president for no reason. That's the official story. This guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, got up in a window and shot the president for no reason that anybody could discern. The Warren Commission never came up with a motive for them. Well, what we've learned in recent years is the story of a lone gunman is so simplistic as it just doesn't describe what was going on in Washington or in President Kennedy's world or among his enemies at the time of the assassination. So in my view, the new information that we've gotten in the last 5 years undermines that story and shows that it simply can't be true. So something else happened. So I think that we're in a position of, what else happened? People say, well, Jeff, you've been studying this thing for years. Surely you have some opinion. I think the most honest way to answer the question, who killed President Kennedy right now, is to say his enemies in his own government managed to kill him and escape the blame. I think that's the most likely explanation. Now, who were they? I mean, these were people high in the national security agencies. I think that's about how much you can limit it, the CIA and the Pentagon. But, who among them? I don't even think that we have somebody who you can describe as anything more than a plausible or likely suspect. Certainly nobody who you could say that person was guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiring to kill the president. That's just, the evidence isn't there, but the evidence is there that the official story that Oswald alone did it, that story is not tenable. The evidence does not support that story. What have we learned in recent years? In the last couple of years, the most important thing I would say is we finally have the CIA's complete file on the alleged assassin, on Lee Harvey Oswald, which we now know before the president was killed, the CIA had collected 194 pages of material on this young man who was a soldier, had been in the Marines, had moved to the Soviet Union for a couple of years and had returned to the United States. So it turns out that the lone gunman, as he was described at the time to the public, a man who apparently came out of nowhere and shot the president, that wasn't true. He was not lone in the sense that he was unobserved by top CIA officials. In fact, very senior CIA officials knew all about him and had been following him for 4 years. So that fact alone, I mean, that's not proof of a conspiracy, but it's a strong indication that the official story is a cover story. And the story, I think one way to put it is what we've learned in recent years is the story of the lone gunman was a cover story designed to cover up the CIA's interest in Oswald. They covered up the interest by portraying him as a loner who was unknown to the agency. He was not unknown to the agency. That is established beyond dispute by the declassification of his file, which was not completed until 2023. For 60 years, portions of this file still remain secret. And one of the things that we learned in 2023, 2 years ago, with a release of Oswald's file, was that the CIA was reading his mail while President Kennedy was in the White House. For the first 18 months of Kennedy's presidency, the CIA was reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail. And we didn't learn until 2023 the name of the man who was doing that on behalf of the chief of CIA counterintelligence, James Angleton. So what we learned was not only had they been following him for 4 years, not only did they have access to his personal thoughts by reading his correspondence with his mother, but they were paying close attention to him. So again, casting doubt on the story of a lone gunman. At a minimum, it's so simplistic as to not explain what was going on. What else have we learned? Earlier this year, one of the most significant documents that came out as a result of President Trump's order was a document that a lot of us had been asking about for a long time. And it was a memo about the CIA, which was written by Kennedy's advisor, historian Arthur Schlesinger. And in the memo, Schlesinger proposes reorganizing the CIA. The memo was written in June 1961 after the failure of the CIA's invasion brigade at Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion brigade was defeated in its attempt to overthrow Castro. Castro, in fact, decisively defeated the invasion brigade, killed 100 of its members, and captured the rest of them. And a triumph for this new socialist government in Cuba, and a complete humiliation for the CIA, which had never been defeated so publicly by communist forces in its whole 14 years of existence. This created a lot of bad blood between the CIA and President Kennedy because they blamed each other for the failure. The CIA men said Kennedy didn't support us with air support when our men were pinned down on the beach by Castro's forces. And Kennedy thought that the CIA had given him a bad plan and was just going to assume that he was going to support them and go to war with Cuba, which he did not want to do. So bad feelings between Kennedy and the CIA. Kennedy wants to address this, and he asks Arthur Schlesinger, what do we do? And Schlesinger, who had served in the intelligence service during World War II, knew something about that world, writes a 15-page memo. Well, for a long time, there was a whole page of that memo that was redacted. And we could read the whole memo. Schlesinger brings together a bunch of arguments. Here's what you should do about the CIA. They're usurping your power to make foreign policy. They're giving you these fait accompli. They're handing you a policy result that they want, and you have to go along with it. So Schlesinger says, let's reorganize the CIA. Let's put it under control of the State Department. And here's all the reasons why. Well, it was a very interesting paper, and it was declassified, most of it, a while ago. But there was always a page that was missing, and was an entire page that was blacked out. So we have the whole document, and then this page is completely covered up with, it's white out. You can't read a thing. It was more than a page. What was in there? And we always wondered what was so secret about that they couldn't do it. Well, we finally got a look, and we understood very well why the CIA wanted to keep this so secret. What did Schlesinger say? He said to President Kennedy, the influence of the CIA on your government is extraordinary, and you probably don't even know it as the president-elect. Schlesinger pointed out that at that point, when President Kennedy was inaugurated in 1961, he had done a study, he had done the research. 47% of State Department officers worldwide were actually CIA officers. So half the people who were representing the US government in the world were actually not representing the State Department. They were representing the covert action arm, the clandestine service of the US government. And so covert action and clandestine activity was usurping diplomacy. I mean, if half the jobs were being done by CIA people, not State Department people. And that was just the beginning of it. In this page, Schlesinger says, 120 people worked for the CIA in the Paris embassy alone. The expending for covert operations in Latin America was far, far higher than anybody knew. And this argument goes on, and this was what we finally got to see for the first time. Schlesinger also tells in that long redacted, long censored passage, he tells a very interesting story about what happened in Paris in 1961. In 1961, some generals in the government of French President Charles de Gaulle tried to overthrow him. De Gaulle was pulling out of the French colony of Algeria, was very controversial within France. It was kind of like France's version of the Vietnam War, a conflict that divided the country very deeply and profoundly. And these generals wanted to stage a coup against de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle had allies in the military and he put down the coup, but Arthur Schlesinger in his memo says on the night of the coup, it was well known that the CIA station occupied the top floor of the US Embassy in Paris. And everybody in Paris noticed that night of the general's coup that the lights were on all night at the CIA station. As if to say the CIA was complicit in a coup attempt against an American ally, which is in fact what de Gaulle believed. De Gaulle did not trust the CIA, and he believed that the CIA had acted against him. Arthur Schlesinger relays all of this to Kennedy, and now, for the first time in 60 years, the rest of us, we get to see what was going on. Now, again, is that smoking gun proof of a plot to kill the president? No, not at all. But it is smoking gun proof that the CIA's influence, secret influence on the government, was far, far larger than the CIA ever admitted. And the CIA intended to hide that fact forever. And it would have stayed secret. We would not have it today if it hadn't been for President Trump's order. So this is one of the most sensitive secrets that the CIA had to keep about Kennedy's assassination, and they intended to keep it forever. So is that significant about the assassination? Yes, it is. Because first of all, the CIA wanted to hide it. That's a significant fact. Second, Kennedy had a problem with the CIA, and he was talking about it with his advisors. This agency is too powerful. Now, Kennedy decided not to do anything. He decided not to implement Schlesinger's suggestions. It was a very difficult, big political project, and Kennedy wasn't ready to do it. But we understand from the new records, from that point forward, Kennedy is quietly on the offensive against the CIA to limit their powers. And the CIA is pushing back constantly against Kennedy, especially on his Cuba policy. So that's kind of the context. One of the new things we learned, which cast the assassination in a new light. The CIA is much more powerful than anybody knew, and Kennedy was worried about it. Now, then we get to things that are, more related to the assassination itself. And these revelations, too, are really interesting. One was the declassification of the personnel file of a CIA officer named George Joannides. And he was the chief of the covert action branch of the Miami station of the CIA, the forward outpost in the war on Cuba. So he's a very senior official in that organization, which employed about 200 CIA officers, biggest CIA station in the world at that time. And Joannides was one of 5 or 6 branch chiefs. So he's one of the top CIA people in Miami. And the file that we obtained earlier this year revealed his secret alias, Howard, while working with Cuban student exiles who had contact with Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. It was his agents who publicized Oswald's pro-Castro activities, something that was very well known to the Warren Commission and to the world, and was essential to establishing the identity of Kennedy's assassin as a communist, a Castro supporter. Well, it turns out from this file that the fact that Oswald was a Castro supporter, that was put forward by a CIA propaganda group in the pay of this man, George Joannides. And the fact that this was happening was denied by the CIA until earlier this year, when they finally admitted that, yes, they had a man named Howard who was working with the Cuban students who knew Oswald. Again, not proof of the assassination, but proof that the CIA was keeping very close tabs on Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged lone gunman who they supposedly knew nothing about. So that's like, again, it undermines the official story. It suggests something else is going on, that such a high-ranking figure could be running an operation involving Oswald, and his existence was unknown to every investigation of the assassination. His existence was not shared with the Warren Commission. It was not shared with congressional investigators in the 1970s. And even in 1998, the CIA was making misleading statements about what George Joannides was doing in the summer of 1963. So a new door opened up, right? Here is a set of eyes, a CIA official who is observing, reporting on, generating propaganda about the man who supposedly killed the president. Is it proof that there was a conspiracy? No. Is it proof that the story of a lone gunman is inaccurate? Yes, it is. It's proof that the lone gunman wasn't lone. He was well known to the CIA. So and then let me just add one more thing that I think we just reported on in my Substack earlier this year. Again, a story that was not known at all. And that is that a man named Bill Harvey, who also worked at the CIA station in South Florida in 1963, Bill Harvey was the chief of the CIA's assassination program. At that time, the CIA was seeking the ability to kill foreign leaders like Fidel Castro in Cuba and others that the U.S. regarded as obstacles to U.S. foreign policy. So Bill Harvey was a career CIA officer, very capable, intelligent, active man, described by some people as America's James Bond. A very highly regarded covert operative, which is why they gave him this very sensitive assignment. We need to go kill some people. Can you help us do that? So Bill Harvey was the kind of hard-boiled spy who the CIA gave that kind of mission to. What we learned from earlier this year, from documents that have been released earlier this year, was that in 1963, Harvey had supposedly been sent to Rome because he had bitter disputes with the Kennedy brothers. And the Kennedy brothers said, we don't want to work with that guy. And the CIA told them, we're sending him to the CIA station in Rome. He won't have anything to do with Cuba operations anymore. What we learned earlier this year is that that wasn't true, and that Harvey remained in the United States when he was supposedly in Rome and was traveling around the United States. And we discovered that he had obtained a fake credential to do that from the Federal Aviation Administration, our civil aviation regulatory agency. It turns out they had given Harvey fake credentials to travel within the United States in 1963 at a time when he was supposedly working in Italy. And we already knew that story was interesting because one of Harvey's colleagues in Italy said that in November 1963, he was in the United States on other business, and he ran into his boss, Bill Harvey, who was on a plane to Dallas in early November 1963. And this man who had worked with Harvey closely, CIA officer in good standing, knew him well, said, why was Bill Harvey in Dallas in 1963? Well, now we learn that he had gone to some lengths to obtain from the FAA a fake credential to travel in the United States at that time. So we still don't know what's going on there, but it's suspicious if Harvey was in Dallas and if he was, and we know he was seeking to travel covertly to evade detection in late 1963, and he was an enemy of the president of the United States. So that's a story that we're developing. There are other records that are coming out that we're going to be reporting on, and I think we're going to explain more about what Bill Harvey was up to. But it's another story that you put it together and you look at the big picture and you say, the story of a lone gunman does not explain these events and does not explain what happened to the president. So that's where we're at. We've learned a lot. We're getting a much more granular picture of CIA operations around Oswald and CIA operations against Kennedy's Cuba policy. And what we see is that opposition of CIA officers opposed to Kennedy's policies and who are watching Oswald, all those things come together catastrophically on November 22nd, when the man who the CIA has been watching for 4 years supposedly shoots and kills the president, and CIA operatives spring up and immediately seek to blame the crime on Cuba. So we see what happened on November 22nd more clearly. We see that Oswald's denials that he was innocent, that he said, I'm a patsy, that's more credible than ever, because we now know that the CIA knew enough about him to, at least some people in the CIA knew enough about him to make him or put him in a position of being a patsy, a fall guy, the person who is, set up to take the blame for a crime he didn't commit. What we've learned in recent years lends credence to what Oswald was saying. That's more plausible than ever now, given how closely he was surveilled by these CIA officers. So, that's just in the last, year. Then we have kind of the bigger picture of Oswald file. And then stepping back from that, we've learned lots of interesting things in recent years that are, tell you something went very wrong here. I'll give you one more example, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about this. We learned, this was about 5 years ago, in a document that was released maybe 7 years ago, 2018, I think. The CIA itself did not believe this story of a lone gunman. And what surfaced in 2017 was a memo that had been written by an officer in the Miami station of the CIA in 1963. And he said, after the president was killed, I was called in and told to ask a series of questions to my Cuban agents. This man worked in the foreign intelligence branch of the Miami station, which was in charge of intelligence collection. And so he had a bunch of Cuban sources working for him. So he was told to go ask his Cuban sources, who known to you, any person looking for guns or money recently, any Cubans known to you who left Miami abruptly recently, any Cubans who have the money capable of orchestrating an attack on President Kennedy for the sake of provoking a war with Cuba, And so there was a series of questions, 5 questions that he was supposed to ask his agents. And he said, all of us officers were asked to apply these same questions to our agents. It was like it was an investigation. Well, that investigation did not focus on Lee Harvey Oswald, did not for a second believe that Oswald had acted alone in killing the president. The premise of the investigation was that the most likely suspects in the assassination, in the eyes of the CIA station in Miami, were anti-Castro, anti-JFK Cubans who were known to the CIA. They did not consider any other suspects in the crime. At least this guy said we were not asked to ask anybody about that. So that fact alone is interesting, that the CIA itself did not believe the lone gunman story and conducted its own investigation. But the other part that's interesting is, well, did they confirm that Oswald acted alone? Did they not find any Cuban exiles were responsible? What did they find? The CIA has never released the results of that internal investigation in 60 plus years. We still don't know about it. But it tells you that the story of the lone gunman is not credible, even in the eyes of the CIA. So, that's kind of where we stand now. We have a lot of evidence about what was going on, about CIA malfeasance, and the CIA lied about all of this and tried to keep all of it out of the public record. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that the official story is probably not true and that we need a better explanation, which probably involves an organized effort to kill the president, and that's what it boils down to. So, those are some highlights of what we've learned in the past year. So, I write about this on my Substack, JFK Facts at Substack.com, and which is a newsletter, and we write. We report on like the Bill Harvey story or the Joanides file. These are the kind of stories we report. We don't really, debate or argue about conspiracy theories. We're not really interested in that. We're interested in what the new information is and what does it tell us. And, a lot. and I should say, one of the frustrating things, Jim, is, last March they released 77,000 pages of CIA documents that had previously had redactions. It didn't mean the 77,000 pages were completely secret. We might have the whole page, but one word or one paragraph, or like the Arthur Schlesinger memo, one page, would be redacted. So all of these redactions came off in these documents that we had for the first time in their complete form. Well, a couple of hours later, I get a call from a reporter and they say, is there a smoking gun? Well, I'm sorry, I can't read 77,000 pages of documents in 90 minutes. But you always get, and people like me always get that call. So, we can't say that's not a very good question. I mean, I try and say that politely, like, give us a little time. So the point being, we're still digesting that material. One of my reporters came up with that Bill Harvey story, going through these records. Nobody else had noticed that. And it's not something that you could find on the first day. So we're still going through all of these records, and we're still generating stories, which we report on JFK Facts. And I'll say one other thing about sources I rely on, and that's a site called the Mary Farrell Foundation, which has the largest online collection of JFK assassination documents on the internet. More than 1 million pages of records, and very well organized and searchable. And I urge people, if you're interested in the Kennedy assassination, to go to maryfarrell.org. And Farrell is spelled Ferrell, maryfarrell.org. And look at the starting points. There's a pull down menu, starting points, and there's JFK assassination. It'll give you, the investigations, the theories, the people, and you can get a really good understanding of it. And again, without the distraction and the stupidity of conspiracy theories, right? I mean, there's some plausible conspiracy theories. There's a lot of really, really stupid, uninformed ones. So at Mary Farrell and JFK Facts, we just put that whole thing aside and educate ourselves. What's the record? What's new? And figure it out for yourself. And at a place like Mary Farrell, you can do that, and you can get a real good background. You can get to key documents, and you can also get to you can get the historical background, and then you can also get the new documents when they come out. They publish them. So the Mary Farrell Foundation published the George Joanides file. So you can both get the background and the latest developments at JFK Facts on Substack or at maryfarrell.org.
Thank you, Jeff. This is fascinating. I've got some questions, but I'm also conscious
Sure.
we've got about 15 minutes left, guys. So there is a Q&A function for our webinar. So if anybody does have any questions, please do put your questions into the chat, and I'll try and collate them to ask Jeff the best I can. There could be lots of questions, so do forgive me if I don't get to everyone's. But you mentioned obviously the CIA were looking at Oswald. They were tracking Oswald. Why? What's their interest in Lee Harvey Oswald?
Well, there was a legitimate interest for that. Oswald had been came from a poor family. His father had died young. He grew up in New Orleans and New York City. He had developed an interest. He was a reader and a self-taught person, not well educated, but kind of an autodidact, and had read Marx at an early age and became entranced with this idea of the classless society. He went into the Marines, dropped out of high school, um, high native intelligence. He was a radar operator. He was regarded as a good soldier by his colleagues, but a bit of an oddball, especially because of his left-wing views were unusual in the military context. But he was, he was perfectly well regarded in the various positions that he had, the various assignments that he had. So, and then in 1959, he quit the Marines and he moved to the Soviet Union out of sympathy for communism. He wanted to live in the homeland of socialism. And so he went there with these high hopes, thinking that this would be much better than the United States, where he had encountered a lot of hostility, racism. Very unusual for a young man from the American South. Oswald was not racist. In fact, had a lot of sympathy for the civil rights movement and for President Kennedy, because President Kennedy was also a supporter of civil rights. It was one of the things that Oswald admired about him. Anyway, the CIA had a legitimate interest in this guy who had gone to live in the Soviet Union. He lived there for a couple of years. He became disillusioned. It was very regimented, for an American who was used to speaking his mind. Oswald felt very controlled. And he married a Russian woman, and then he moved back to the United States in 1962. So there was a reason to pay attention to him while he was there. But when he came back, the CIA they never treated him as a security risk. They kept an eye on him, they followed him, but they never took any action against him. And that suggests strongly that he was being used for some other purpose. They had a reason to pay attention to him. He was a defector. He lived in the Soviet Union. Maybe he was a Soviet spy. But they never took that possibility. The people who were watching him never worried about that. They had other uses for him. So that's the thing about Oswald was, we were told, American people were told, well, yes, we were paying attention to him because he was a defector, but we didn't really pay attention to him. That story is utterly false. They were paying very close attention to him the whole time. So, and it wasn't for security reasons only. They had other reasons to watch him. So that's why they were paying attention to Oswald. But what's interesting is this other interest that they had that was never disclosed, and that only now are we learning all about, like his relationship with George Joannides and his agents from the Miami station in South Florida. So the picture we have about Oswald is much more complex than the lone gunman story supposed.
Because it almost sounds as if, like, just putting like I know you've called it the fact pattern in the past. If I'm kind of trying to follow that fact pattern, it takes me to the idea that was this almost a kind of a false flag, where basically some of the Cubans and with some rogue elements did this to try to provoke the war. It's almost like the Operation Mongoose were trying to get Kennedy into Cuba, but obviously Kennedy's death will go into Cuba that way.
Yeah, no, I mean that is exactly what the new evidence suggests. And let me point to another thing that we've learned, not in the last 2 or 3 years or 5 years, but in the last 20, that's very important. This is since Oliver Stone's movie. And that was a Pentagon operation called Operation North Woods. And you used the phrase false flag, okay? And we hear that phrase a lot now, false flag operation. So Operation North Woods, adopted by the Pentagon in 1962 and again in 1963, was the classic in a way, false flag operation. And the idea that the Pentagon had was this: look, this guy Castro, he's very tough. We can't get rid of him. His people are not rebelling against him. He's popular. He's got control of his society. He's got these Soviet advisors. We can't touch the guy. So what do we do? Well, the Pentagon's solution was, here's what we do. We stage a spectacular crime in the United States, plane hijacking, terror attack, that sort of thing. And we use covert personnel to make it look like Castro did it. Okay, that's the false flag. We put the flag on him. We assign this to the Cuban flag, not to the American flag. Okay, and the idea was that if that happened, then the American president could go to the people and say, look, Cuba is a lawless rogue actor. You know, they've attacked us, they've hijacked our plane or whatever. And therefore, we're justified in going and overthrowing them. So this was the way the Pentagon wanted to win, to overthrow Castro, since nothing else seemed to be working. That was the plan, the Pentagon's plan in the summer of 1963. Stage a spectacular crime and arrange for the blame to fall on Castro. Well, on November 22nd, somebody staged a spectacular attack on a U.S. target, and CIA operatives immediately set out to blame the crime on Cuba. It was exactly like what Operation Northwoods called for. And remember this, Operation Northwoods was completely secret. It was never disclosed to wasn't to the Warren Commission, which investigated the crime, or the congressional committees, which reinvestigated the crime 15 years later in the 1970s. They didn't know anything about this. This wasn't discovered till 1997, 5 years after Oliver Stone's movie had been made extremely controversial for the suggestion that high-level people in the Pentagon and the CIA might have, been involved in the assassination of the president for the sake of provoking a war with Cuba. And so Operation Northwoods really showed that it wasn't the invention of a Oliver Stone or a Hollywood screenwriter. Stone didn't know anything about it. His screenwriters didn't know anything about it. And if they had, they would have written it into the movie. And I know Oliver Stone, and I've asked him to this, and he said, absolutely. This is exactly what we thought was going on. This was the idea we were trying to convey in the movie, of this anti-democratic conspiratorial mindset at the top of the U.S. government in 1963.
But it almost seems that then if you follow this pattern, that it is this operation where they're trying to get the US to go into Cuba. What happens, of course, is actually escalation in Vietnam instead. So Lyndon Johnson is not. I think even when the Warren Commission is happening, we want to make sure we want to stop all the blame being thrown around. We want to nip this in the bud and move on. And then
and Johnson's very much that way, and that's what the Warren Commission was designed to do. And Johnson said this, we were at risk of going to war. People wanted to go to war. Johnson didn't want to go to war. He wanted calm. And so right away, the first day or 2 days later, Johnson says, we have to come to the conclusion that this guy Oswald alone did it. We're not going to look at any other possibility. That's what Johnson said 3 days after the assassination.
Hmm.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said the same thing on the same day. We need to convince the public that this guy was the lone assassin and he had no Confederates. Okay. The investigation had barely begun. So why were they doing this? Because they did not want anyone looking at what had actually gone into this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald. And so very quickly they settled on this story. This guy did it, and don't worry about anything else, move on. But we see now this mentality in Operation Northwoods. We see this interest in Oswald, people like George Joannides. We see this murderous intention to defy Kennedy on the part of people like Bill Harvey. And that's the big picture. And I say, you mentioned it. Don't look for a smoking gun, okay? Don't look for one piece of evidence. Look for a fact pattern. And what does that fact pattern tell you? And especially, what does the new fact pattern tell you? Because this is the stuff that they wanted to hide the longest. So logically speaking, the thing that was released most recently is the thing they wanted to hide the longest, right? By definition. And the thing you hide the longest, by definition, is the thing that you don't want anybody to know about. So that's why the recent disclosures are significant. And so there's the recent fact pattern for us. It's like this situation was much more incriminating, murky, dangerous, deceitful, and lethal than anybody knew. And we still don't know it completely, but we have learned a lot. So
I think we mentioned about the investigation better because we got a couple of questions from the students. One is, why did Jack Ruby kill Oswald? And another question is just to make sure we we cover it because it's obviously such a good one. Is was there any way in which the censorship and then the subsequent declassification of these files have changed the view that Americans actually view political violence?
Um, on the on the first question, why did Ruby kill Oswald? I mean, Oswald said, "I'm innocent and I'm a patsy," implying that somebody else was involved. So if a witness is saying that and the witness is killed, I mean, the presumption, I mean, it's not the final conclusion, but the presumption has to be that the witness knew something. I mean, why would Jack Ruby step and kill a man on national TV? First time it had ever happened. Unless, there was some serious motivation to do that. And the most logical motivation is to silence the witness who denied responsibility. So that's one basic fact. The second thing is, the Warren Commission, in its haste to get rid of the story, never investigated who Jack Ruby actually was. And Jack Ruby he was an organized crime wannabe. He had grown up in Chicago. Jack Rubenstein was his name. And he was a kind of foot soldier in the Chicago mob, which was Al Capone, legendary gangster, who was succeeded by a man named Sam Giancana, another legendary gangster. And this was the world that Ruby grew up in. And he moved from Chicago to Dallas. He opened up a strip club, and he aspired to be one of these guys. So I was on the Piers Morgan show a couple of months ago, and there was another guy on the show, Michael Franzine, who had been an organized crime guy, and now is like talks on TV about he's turned state's witness. So he talks about his experience in organized crime. And he said, and I found this very convincing, he said, all of the crime bosses who he dealt with in his whole life always said the exact same thing. What was our role in it? Our role was to get rid of the witness. And so, the implication was that Ruby acted at the behest of organized crime figures to eliminate the witness, Oswald. And I find that story very plausible. I talked to a woman who worked in Jack Ruby's nightclub, one of the dancers, and she was friends with Ruby. She'd worked with him over the years a couple of times. He liked her a lot. And I asked her, I said, "Why did your friend Jack kill Lee?" And she said, "I don't think he had a choice." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, Jack worked for people. Everybody works for somebody. And I think that the people he worked for said, "You got to do this." Now, I said, "So who was that?" She said, "I was a 20-year-old kid. I was a dancer in a club. I didn't know what was going on in his world. I knew him. I was friendly with him, but I didn't know that stuff." But that was just her impression. And, I think in combination with Michael Franzine's comments, I think that tells you what's going on. Now, the second question was, does all of this new information change anybody's mind in the United States? Probably not. The conspiracy theory industry is very strong. Once people get interested in this story and realize the official story is probably not true, then they become very motivated and read all the theories and adopt a theory. And then once people adopt a theory, they never change their mind because people want to believe that they're right. So, I don't think that is this going to change people's minds. Maybe in the long run, there's a lot of new information, and these stories that are coming out, no one of them is the smoking gun that people yearn for. But collectively, people are going to learn. Young people like you guys are going to learn, more and more about the story. And I think that will eventually, we will arrive at a new consensus about what happened. But when that will happen, I don't know.
So I think that I'm really reluctant to bring this to a close because I'm having such a good time, and I'm sure our other attendees are. But I think on that note about what young people can do, think about students looking for projects or maybe graduate careers and so on. What is there still to do for students to write about and research about for Kennedy, especially when it comes to this world that you're um, blazing the trail in terms of the assassination?
you know, there these records are new. There are things that were never seen before, and we're beginning to, scratch the surface. So What can people do? I think by educating yourself about what has come out in recent years and what were the new things that you learn. I think, there's original research to be done there. You're not recycling somebody else's thing because these scholars never knew about it. So, for example, um, one of the things that's just come out that we're going through right now is the records of what was called the Church Committee. The Church Committee was a committee created by the US Senate in 1975 to reinvestigate not just the Kennedy assassination, but allegations of CIA abuses of power. And it turned into this big investigation of the CIA's abuses of power and assassination plots over the years. Well, the testimony that senior CIA officials gave to that committee behind closed doors in secret has been kept secret for many years. And now, just this summer, just in July, several hundred pages, all the redactions have been removed. Okay. I think that if students look at and educate themselves, what was the church committee doing? Who was this guy who was testifying? If you go through then look at that and then look at, oh, what were they trying to hide for all these years? And it might be a sentence, might be a code name, might be a paragraph about a CIA technique or a source. Those documents, that's brand new information. So what's to be done? Write a paper about, what did these CIA officials say about Kennedy's assassination or about assassination plots in general, that was so secret that we know now. And you'll have an original material there that nobody's ever written about before. So yes, because of these disclosures, there's a lot of work of original research that, undergraduates and graduate students can do right now.
And of course, it's a lot of sort of owes a debt to people like yourself. You sued the CIA, I believe, to get
Yeah.
documents. So I think everyone interested in this topic certainly owes a debt of thanks to yourself and your
Yeah.
colleagues. Just lastly, Jefferson, how can people find you? How can they keep track of what you're doing?
So JFK Facts on Substack is jfkfacts.substack.com. We post few items, maybe not every day, but 3, 4 a week, about new records or about interviews I've done or uh, new testimonies that have been taken. We really focus, again, not on theories, but on like, what's really new here, what's new and indisputable, and that's why I call attention to the documents that have just been declassified. So yeah, that's the way to keep up with what I'm doing. And then also, like I said before, if you want to understand more, get more background about the story, maryfarrell.org, which is also posting new things all the time. And if you spend time on that site, you can get to know this story and be, I would say, fluent in it. I mean, conversant, well educated, not like spouting off, but like know the basics and some of the key details. And then, that's when you can write a good paper. That's when you can have a good discussion. So once you've mastered those information, and there's tons of new information to be had.
Yeah. Thank you ever so much, Jefferson. I really appreciate your time. And sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but the ones we have had have been brilliant, and you've been brilliant as well. I said before, I feel like I've met one of my heroes. So thank you ever so much, Jefferson Morley. It's been an absolute
Glad to do
pleasure.
it, Tim.